if you have a bad wild oat problem, you probably should use the likes of Axial Pro or some of the other wild oat herbicides on the tank mix on its own. So from that point of view, you tend then to need 7 days before you can come back with another product, be it a hormone type herbicide or an SU or something like that. So that's probably the best way to go about a bad wild oat situation, where you go with the wild oat herbicide first and then come back in 7 days later with whatever the chemistry you're going to use to control the other weeds.
Poor weed control is the most visible mistake you can make. Rowing remaining plants may help, but it's often a problem you have to live with for the rest of the growing season. Wild oat control is certainly becoming harder on many farms, but is this due to inadequate spray coverage, or is it herbicide resistance? You're listening to the latest episode of Tillage Edge with me, Michael Hennessy. If you're enjoying the series, we'd appreciate it if you could follow the podcast and leave a review on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from. Sequencing weed control alongside aphid management and other priorities, such as correcting trace element deficiencies, can be challenging. So today I'm delighted to welcome Ciaran Collins and Shay, Phelan, both tillage specialists in Teagasc, to discuss spring cereal weed control strategies and how it fits into the overall management of the crop. Shay, can I start with you first? You might just maybe walk us through a typical weed spectrum, if there is such a thing, that people would expect to see in spring cereals.
Yeah, it's difficult to give a kind of overarching sort of, everybody has these weeds, but there's probably a couple of weeds there, Michael, that are probably most people are familiar with, or probably should be familiar with. Probably things like charlock, chickweed, cleavers are probably three that would be very, very common. But like the likes of fat hen, groundsel, even likes of poppy is becoming more and more of an issue out there. So they're there around as well. So and probably a couple of other ones that people generally kind of get around there. Some people have, we're hearing lots of problems with likes of corn marigold out there. So that can be a particular challenge if you happen to have it. And we're also seeing bits of red shank and things like that as well. So I mean, it's very, very difficult to give. Everybody's going to have these. Obviously, each field is going to have a different spectrum. And I suppose one piece of advice I'd have for farmers or agronomists or whoever are starting out looking at weeds, start at the headlands, start at the hedgerows and work out from there. And you tend to find a lot of your charlocks, the likes of, as I said before, the likes of cleavers and things like that, they tend to move out from the margins and out into the field. So that's probably, I suppose, as good a place to start as any.
And I suppose the chances are, Shay, it doesn't, those weed or that weed spectrum in a general sense doesn't really change hugely from one year to the next. So maybe some of the records that people might have previously might help too.
Yeah, for sure. And if you have records of those weeds before and you've seen them before, that they will change. They will predominantly be the same. Probably the one, Michael, that can change up and down depending on the machinery that are in the field or who's working the fields are things like wild oats and some of the grass weeds. So particularly wild oats, if you have a baler or a combine that's come from a field that's rotten with wild oats, they certainly can be transported in the machinery into a field. So that's probably a weed potentially that could surprise you.
Okay. And Ciaran, just to bring you in there, just in terms of that full spectrum of weeds that Shay is talking about, and knowing your history is probably a really good thing in that. I was just thinking, and perhaps maybe it's a little late for a lot of crops out there, maybe something people could be thinking about in the future or already have done. The pre-emerge type scenario in spring cereals versus post-emerge, because obviously pre-emerge would be a very big factor in winter cereals, but is there a reason why it's not more popular in spring cereals?
There is, I suppose, really. Look, to go backwards, the majority of weed control in, say, spring cereals or spring barley in particular would be early post-emergence. And we all know that type of ideal scenario, where you get good growthy day, the weeds are just up their cotyledon stage, and they're actively growing. And we do get great control, in fairness, at those timings if you can get the right weather conditions. Pre-em, as you say, popular with winter cereals, particularly for grassweed control. So there are some pre-em options for spring cereals. I suppose the one that's kind of most widely used would be something like a combination of, say, pendimetal and DFF that you would get in something like Tower. The issue, and maybe why pre-em isn't practiced as widely, firstly, it can be difficult to do in the spring, but secondly, you need moisture in the soil for a pre-em herbicide to work. And we don't always, well, I suppose ideally with spring barley, we're sowing into dust. So, they're the type of conditions that don't favor a pre-em herbicide. However, there are some people doing it. I have come across scenarios where people have had issues with annual meadowgrass in particular, and they have used the likes of Tower. And I know we had an experience in the ECT project where we used Avidex, where people had resistant wild oats, and that was a pre-em. And I would say we know that Avidex is very good on wild oats, but I would say it was a kind of 50-50 as to whether it worked or not because of the dryness of the soil at the time.
Sure. I suppose, Ciaran, the other side of that is they're you're sowing a relatively dense spring cereal type of crop, and the denser it is, the chances are it's going to compete better and maybe crowd out some of the weeds that might be coming through with the likes of meadowgrass.
Yeah, exactly.
Shay, I just wanted to come to you. You mentioned wild oats there, and is there a specific recommendation for controlling wild oats? Obviously, there's specific products, but is there a way of making sure that the farmer kind of gets it right in terms of controlling the broadleaf weeds in one hand and the wild oats then in the other hand?
Yeah, for sure, Michael. If we take spring barley as the biggest crop in the country, and probably going to be most of the area of spring cropping that we have this year, you're really limited in terms of what you can do for wild oat control there. So there's only a couple of products that you can actually use, and probably Axial Pro is the one that is most commonly used, and for it, I suppose there is a specific set of guidelines to using it in terms of getting your best activity out of it. So if you're looking at trying to control wild oats and you have a wild oat problem in a farm or in a field, you're probably best to go with a wild oat herbicide early. And early, I mean probably mid-tillering or somewhere around there before you get a lot of shading from the crop, because spring barley, if you like, tends to grow very, very quickly. And if you leave it too long, you have to get coverage. And people have to remember, you have to get coverage on all the wild oat leaves. If you only get it on one leaf or one tiller, you won't probably kill the other tiller. So you can have poor control from that point of view. So you need to get that on early. Okay, so when we decide then we're going to go early, probably for a lot of people, they're talking maybe trying to combine that with an insecticide or something like that and broadleaf weed control. And I suppose this is where it starts to get a little bit complicated, because, there is this fear that some people have that, we don't want to put them all into a tank. And for sure, if you have a bad wild oat problem, you probably should use the likes of Axial Pro or some of the other wild oat herbicides on their own, on a tank mix on its own. So from that point of view, you tend then to need 7 days before you can come back with another product, be it a hormone type herbicide or an SU or something like that. So if you like, that's probably the best way to go about a bad wild oat situation, where you go with the wild oat herbicide first and then come back in 7 days later with whatever the other chemistry you're going to use to control the other weeds. The second best option, especially if you're getting caught for time, and I appreciate that a lot of winter or spring barley has gone in late this year, so timings are going to get very, very tight, and the chance to do these are going to get very, very tight. So the second best option then is to apply both the wild oat herbicide, be it in this case Axial Pro, with your broadleaf weed herbicides, be that a sulfonylurea and or a hormone type herbicide. And in that case, you can do that, that's fine, but you need to apply a decent rate of the likes of Axial Pro. So you're talking minimum rate of probably 0.6 of a litre per hectare in that case. And I suppose the one we want to try and avoid is whereby a farmer goes in and applies, say, a sulfonylurea, maybe even a growth regulator and or a hormone herbicide. If that goes in first, you now must wait a minimum of 21 days before you come back in with the wild oat herbicide. And the reason being is that the effect of the hormone or the growth regulator or the SU on that wild oat will reduce the efficacy, or the uptake, should I say, of the wild oat herbicide. So you don't get the same efficacy from the wild oat herbicide, because the weed isn't growing as actively as it would be without the presence of those other herbicides. So they're the three, if you like, scenarios, Michael, that we have to think about when we're trying to control wild oats in spring, especially spring barley at the moment.
Okay. And Ciaran, maybe you might be able to put all that or pull all that together just in the sense of, where a farmer has all of those options or all of those problems, I suppose, out in the field, broadleaf weeds, wild oats is there, and perhaps there's the trace element deficiency as well. There's an aphicide to go in. What have you found practically on the ground in terms of, products that would actually do the trick for a farmer?
Okay, in terms of compatibility, I suppose it's often a difficult one, but I suppose from experience, the first thing I would say is that spraying conditions are very important. That if you have that sort of good growthy day that you get in May, the crop can be, can tolerate maybe a little bit more. But I suppose in fairness, over the years we have used both broadleaf weed control, wild oats and aphicides in the one tank. So that would look like maybe something like a sulfonylurea with something then to target other weeds, say something like a Galaxy as IPAR, maybe a Floxipur based product like Hurler, and then with your aphicide with that and your wild oat herbicide, that all goes together fine. It can get a little bit trickier when you start adding trace elements to it. I think in general, people have found that most types of manganese, which is probably maybe the typical one that you would use at that time of year, does mix fairly well. So look, I think that sort of mix will work fine, but I think the weather conditions at the time of application are very important.
So what would you be thinking about? Sort of strong growth on the day, or is it a bit more that's needed either side?
Well, it's both ways. It's
Okay.
when you're applying, I suppose, a few days before and maybe 3 or 4 days after. It's that during a period of good growth, really. And, in that scenario, that type of mix wouldn't do any harm to the crop.
Okay. And Shay, back to you there. You mentioned, there's potential problems with resistance out there. Would you have an example or two of where farmers came up against this kind of resistant issues, and what was the solution that was found for that?
Yeah, it's. I suppose it is a growing concern, Michael. There's no two ways about it, and we have seen issues out there across the country. With if you take wild oats from is probably a growing one, but there are also issues out there with the likes of corn marigold, poppies, speedwell, chickweed, all those type of weeds, and a few more new ones, I suppose, if you like, in terms of maybe something like red shank. So in that case, I suppose one of the key things would be we're looking at the herbicide resistance group. So what herbicides are they resistant to? So if you take the broadleaf weeds, for argument's sake, what we're tending to see are in certain fields across the country, not every field, but in certain fields we are seeing resistance to, say, the likes of sulfonylureas, so the likes of Cameo Max, Ali Max, those type of products, right? So in those cases, there's probably two things that you would encourage a farmer to do straight away. Number one is to put a mixture product with it. Like Ciaran said there, the likes of the Zypar, be it Galaxy, be it Roxipar, something with a different mode of action. So you're not relying on a single chemical to do all the heavy lifting. With that too, you also need to increase your rate. So you need to be using probably 3/4 to probably full rates of the herbicide that you're allowed to use. And I think traditionally what has been done over the last number of years is reduced rates of the likes of SUs, possibly could be causing, or not causing, but certainly adding to the problem. And the other thing I think a lot of people should be looking at then is rotations. So crop rotations, look at different options there in terms of whether it be beans or beet or potatoes or something else, something where you can use different types of chemistry. So if you like, say, from the grassweed point of view, if you have a problem with a certain grassweed, maybe some of the other chemistry that are available on those, and take likes of oil scrape, where you can use the likes of astrocurb. So that would help you to get over some of the grassweed issues. And I suppose it's kind of knowing what problem you have there, not just ignoring it. And the final thing I suppose that people can actually do in that is, however they can, and I'd say something like wild oats, probably relatively simple, to stop seed return if at all possible. And especially, I suppose, where guys, and I'm kind of going off it a little bit now, but likes of blackgrass or something like that, where we would have seen guys spraying off crops to stop that seed return. that's something that I think we kind of need to get a little bit better at in terms of that's next year's generation of resistant seeds and resistant weeds. So we need to stop them going back into the ground if at all possible.
Okay, and Ciaran, I suppose with that in mind, about maybe spraying out patches or identifying patches in the field, how good are farmers, do you think, in mapping out those areas and making sure that they are conscious of where those weed patches are in following years?
Yeah, I suppose the key to it really is getting into the field maybe 2 to 3 weeks even after that herbicide application. And it's a good time to do it before the crop rightly closes in of spring barley, say, and just have a look, see what survived, what's dead, and then if you're seeing weeds that are survived, you survivors, you go back and you say, okay, what rate did I use? What were the conditions like at the time, and all of that. And if I've done everything correctly, well, then you might maybe suspect resistance. So that's the first thing. And then it's like it's live weeds next to dead weeds. That's the key one there. And I think the other one is a little bit later in the season. Say wild oats is probably a good example. You're seeing a little scatter of wild oats around the field. Again, ask yourself all those questions when I put out the wild oat herbicides. What was the rate? What were the conditions? What were they like? And then if they're still there, it is worth maybe taking some samples of those and contact anyone in Teagasc so we can get them tested, do a resistance test for you. So they'd be the key things really, but I think it's just monitoring, getting back into the field post application and having a look and see what's around.
Okay, and one of the other things I suppose that I know, Shay, you have been looking at during the crop walks over the last 3 weeks. You've been looking at I suppose, the effectiveness of the sprayer and how well those droplets actually get to the target. You might give us an idea of what you were seeing and maybe was it much of a surprise to you?
Yeah, it's a good point, Michael, because I suppose it's the idea would have started here back a couple of months back here in the glass house here when VJ here, a weed researcher, was doing some resistance testing on particularly wild oats, and he would have seen that probably about 60 to 70% of the suspected samples that were brought in here to Oak Park for testing for resistance, only about 60 to 70% of them actually presented resistance or were resistant to the chemicals that we were testing them against. So that means somewhere between 30 and 40% of the samples that we were sent in here were still being controlled by the herbicides that we applied here. So that gives us the idea that there's probably issues out there at farm level in terms of making sure that people get these chemistries on as best they possibly can. So what we're doing at the moment is looking at spray patterns. And again, I'm not an expert in sprayers and that type of thing, but certainly been talking to like Dermot Forrest, who people will have known when he's since retired from Teagasc, about this and thinking about how we can get the product onto the target as best we possibly can, whether that be a weed, whether it be a pest, whatever it happens to be. And look at in terms of nozzle technology, we're kind of maybe in some cases a little bit complacent about, we're losing the likes of low drift nozzles and things like that. But if you actually look at the labels of a lot of products, low drift nozzles are not specified on those labels. So it's a compromise straight away. So other compromises that farmers tend to use in terms of water volume, forward speed, ground pressure, and as Ciaran said earlier on, the conditions in which you spray, whether it's windy, whether it's wet, the crop is wet, whether it's cold, whether it's hot, that type of thing. So all these can affect the efficacy of the product that you're using. So what we're doing, and I've done in the last couple of crop walks, is showing farmers the impact of, say, the different nozzle types, forward speed on the spray pattern. We use things like water sensitive paper to mirror what's going on from the nozzle, so people can actually see where the droplets are falling onto the leaves of, say, for example, in this case, a wild oat. So it gives people a very visual demonstration of the effect of all the things that are combined that farmers are doing in the tractor or in the cab of the tractor as they're going through the field. And it just reminds me of a quote of a guy that most people were probably aware of, who's also retired, is a fellow by the name of Tom Gartland, who used to do quite a bit of this work years ago. And he used to always say 50% of the control is in the can and 50% of the control is in the cab. And that means that farmers have to be careful about how they put these products on, because what we're seeing, and it's kind of maybe it's ringing through a little bit in what Tom was saying. What we're seeing coming into the glass house here in Oak Park lately is suggesting that there are issues out there with application. So we're trying to address that.
So you would have seen, because you were showing me one of them there, Shay, that if you can remind everybody, what did it look like in terms of the standard, I suppose, would be somebody with a 75% drift reduction nozzle, probably spraying at, 120 or 150 litres per hectare, which is probably going at 12 or 14 kilometres an hour. What would that look like? Is that good, bad, or indifferent, did you see?
That's probably a standard, if you like, out there at the moment, Michael. And what you tend to find in those is that you get big droplets. All right, you have less drift, which is most people are trying to achieve. So you have less drift, so that actually broadens the weather windows, if you like, that you can actually spray in. So you can spray in slightly windier weather. Now, not gale force winds or anything like that, but slightly windier weather. But the issue with that is those droplets, they can have a lot of energy and bounce off the leaf, so you might just get good contact on the leaf, but also the spray pattern. And sometimes these don't spray it as best you possibly can. Now people are putting in spreaders and wetters and all that sort of thing to try and overcome that. But if you're to look at the pattern of those versus a flat fan nozzle, which as a medium to fine a spray pattern, which is, if you like, what's on most of the herbicide labels that we see there at the moment, the pattern is nowhere near as comprehensive for that low drift nozzle as it happens to be for the flat fans. So, it's trying to minimize that difference is what we're trying to do, and that can be done. It's speeds, water volumes, those type of things. So it's not, like I say, I'm not an expert in it. The likes of Dermot, who's unfortunately gone now from us, is the likes of Francis Quigley will be more adept at it. But again, it's trying to see a practically what's going on farms and trying to do the best that they possibly can to get the best result they possibly can.
So I suppose it's a good idea for farmers to try and get themselves a bit more up to speed and a bit more knowledge in terms of their sprayer nozzles that are on the sprayer and that kind of thing.
Exactly that, Michael. And there are all sorts of charts, molecular charts, and all these different charts out there, which you can give you an idea of what they have. But the water sensitive paper it's a very useful little tool. It's in much the same way as guys would be out there testing their fertilizer spreaders at the beginning of the year to make sure they're getting good spread patterns. Like these water sensitive papers, they only cost about €50 for a batch or €60 for a batch of about 40 or 50 little pieces of water or strips. So they're very, very cheap to get and to use, and you just stick them to a peg or something like that in the ground, and you run the sprayer over, and you see what sort of spray pattern you're getting. And generally, you're looking for anything up to about 50% coverage of that piece of paper, and that's generally as good as you'll get.
Okay. Listen, that's brilliant, Shay and Ciaran. Thanks very much for that. So there's loads of tips there for farmers just to look at to try and get the best out of the ag chems they're going to be buying this year. Thanks very much, guys. We'll be chatting to you shortly again.
Thanks, Michael.
So that's it for this episode, and my thanks to Shay and Ciaran for joining me on the show. The Teagasc Spring Walks continued next week with a walk on Wednesday the 29th in Borrisokane and Tipperary, and the remaining walks in Kerry, Offaly and Donegal in the following week. At each event, we'll be discussing the agronomy of spring crops with a particular focus on managing rising costs and tackling wild oat herbicide resistance. Full details of all of the events are available at the Teagasc website, and you should receive some information from your local advisor in advance. So that's it for today, and as usual, if you enjoyed the podcast, then recommend it to a friend or a colleague, and as always, rate, review and follow on Apple or Spotify so you never miss an episode. And for more information, go to teagasc.ie. I'm Michael Hennessy, thanks for listening. I'll be back next week with more tillage news and advice.